Hello, everybody. My name is Hunter Ohanian, and I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And today is June 9th, 2020. And so we want to welcome everybody here for the next edition of our virtual talks. Just to put the proper context on this, the United States and also the world have been in the middle of a national pandemic. And by all accounts, we are somewhat coming to a close. However, there is a lot of concern about how long this will continue. As of today, there have been 109,000 people in the United States who have lost their lives. Worldwide, there have been over 1 million people who have been infected. The majority of the United States has been without economic activity for the last 2.5 to 3 months. Some states are now beginning to reopen. We have actually seen the Congress of the United States put in over $2 trillion to help the economy, and particularly to help people cover their food and their rent. It's a situation that many of us could never have imagined under any circumstance that we're faced with right now. As far as employment goes in the United States, we are seeing that there might be as many as 30 million people who have lost their jobs. It could be as high as 1/3 of the workforce have lost their jobs. We have put a lot of restrictions in place. Many restaurants and bars were closed at this period of time. There's a lot of things about social distancing. I remember 2 months ago, I didn't even know, or 3 months ago, I didn't know what social distancing meant as a term. But many of us we carry our masks with us all the time, and it's just a very bizarre time. On top of it, the time that we're in right now, as many of you might know, over the last several years, there have been a number of demonstrations and responses to what people might refer to as racial injustice by police forces throughout the United States. And an incident happened 2 weeks ago yesterday in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in which a lovely man by the name of George Floyd was killed by a police officer who kept his knee on the individual's neck for close to 9 minutes, 8 minutes and some odd seconds. Mr. Floyd, unfortunately, it was a result of him trying to pass a counterfeit bill, or an alleged counterfeit bill, an alleged $20 bill, and he lost his life. That particular action by the police officer that led to to George's death has resulted in demonstrations and riots in more than 250 cities throughout the United States. On this day, actually, he's being laid to rest in his where he grew up in Houston. But the demonstrations have actually been all throughout the entire world as a result. That people have really responded to the racism, the systemic and institutional racism that they have witnessed. And they've really found this time to find a voice to say enough is enough, and they simply can't take it anymore. So the Stonewall National Museum and Archives is located here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We have 28,000 books in our library. Our archive consists of 2,700 linear feet of material, mostly from the last quarter of the 20th century to the present day. If you imagine what 2,700 linear feet looks like, it's all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other side. It's over 6 million pages. And so we're one of the 10 major repositories for queer literature in the United States. Because society and cultural output has been so stilted because of the pandemic, and then also because of the disruptions that have been going on recently with demonstrations, we decided about 5-6 weeks ago that we would start doing programming virtually like we are here this evening. So if you want to get our newsletter and find out who's coming up next, just go to stonewall-museum.org and you can sign up for the newsletter there. You can find out what's happening at Stonewall. I also urge you to look at your local queer organizations wherever you are to see what kind of programming they're doing and figuring out ways that you can actually help support them, because everybody's trying to do things differently. As I was saying earlier today, if somebody said to me 3 months ago that we would be doing virtual Zoom talks like this, I don't know that I would have thought it was a great idea, but we have now gotten to the point where this is a way that we're going to begin to communicate with each other. So I'm very happy to have with us this evening. And by the way we'll structure this is that I'll be with our guests until 7:15. And then we'll ask people to submit their quick questions. You can put your quick questions up anytime, either in the quick question part or in the chat part, and then save those, and then we'll go to the quick questions at the end, and we will get to the quick questions then. And also, this is being taped so that it will show up on the Stonewall Museum website under I think it's under the public programming page. And if you look now, you can see there are things from Esther Newton. We did a great talk with Jonathan Katz. Last week we had curator Alexis Heller. And so we'll just add this to all of the other great talks and chats that we've had. And as I say, it's important content for us to look at now, but it's also important for us to look at this from an archival standpoint. It's important for researchers who have yet to be born. All of those doctoral theses that will be happening 10, 15, 20 years from now, for them to be able to look at what it is that we were thinking about at this period of time. It's a really important written record or digital record of what it is that we were thinking about. And we'll be old and gray at the time that they look at it. And maybe, who knows, if they do something digitally, they'll ask us to participate and say what it was like at the time. So go to the Stonewall website and you can see things there. So joining me this evening is Maya Ciarrocchi. Maya is a Bronx-based interdisciplinary artist working in installation, video performance, and social practices. In these projects, she uses storytelling and embodied map making to reveal vanished histories of the past. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and she's received residencies and fellowships. It's an amazing list from the Baryshnikov Arts Center, the Bronx Museum of the Arts, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the McDowell Colony, the Malay Colony, UCross, and UCross I think is Wyoming or somewhere out in the western part of the US, and Wave Hill. And also with me today is Kris Gray. Kris, I've known for many years. He worked with me at the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York. And Kris is a New York-based transgender artist who uses their body as raw material, often presenting themselves in states of extreme vulnerability as an invitation to all of us to experience transcendence or discover hidden queer histories. Kris's cultural work includes curatorial projects, performance, writing, and studio production, and ceramics. And Kris is an artist in residence right now at Penn State. So welcome to both of you. I'd love for you both to say hi. Maya.
Hello all. Hunter, thank you so much for having us.
It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Just to say that also just thinking about where we are in the arc of colonialism, and thinking about how we name where we are and where we're tuning in from today. So just to acknowledge that currently in Brooklyn, New York, which is unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie people, among other indigenous tribes. And when I'm in Pennsylvania, I am doing my work and living on the unceded territories of the Susquehannock people.
Thank you for that, Kris. So first question for both of you, and either of you can jump in first. So I know this is a very general, broad question, but how are you doing in this period of time?
Who wants to go first?
Who wants to say? I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, I feel really incredibly lucky. I'm well in health, and I have not lost all of my income, which I think is a really unique. A unique position given the context. I have a visiting artist position at Penn State, as Hunter mentioned, and it's a 2-year contract. So I've just finished my first year of full-time teaching for Penn State, which of course transitioned to remote content delivery in the spring semester. So a wild year to be re-entering academia in a serious way. But I have to say that the things that are making me feel well and keep connected to folks in this age of physical distancing are opportunities like this, and then opportunities to show small kindnesses for my neighbors in both Brooklyn and in State College, Pennsylvania, and to be caring for folks that are around me and that I am in closer contact with.
Yeah, certainly this has brought out a lot of closeness to other individuals, even though physically we can't be close to them. It's brought out a situation that requires us to be close to other people. Maya, how are you doing?
I am also very grateful for many things. I'm grateful for my health, that I have a great apartment, which has a view, and so I can enjoy looking at nature and the outside world, even if it's not that accessible, or that I can't participate in it in the way that I'd want to necessarily. I feel like since this all started, I've been in a state of mourning, and mourning has manifests itself in lots of different ways. And also just managing my own personal grieving with the grieving of the rest of the world and the scale of that, so that my losses are so minuscule compared to the losses of others. So just managing that and letting the emotions sort of come and go with that. And it's been also fascinating to, I mean, I think many of us, many artists, cultural workers, we think in the future all the time. We think about a year to 2 years ahead. And now it's not possible to even think, like, I think in a week, you know, and every week has to be reevaluated and reframed. So that's been fascinating. And I've more into that. I mean, it's, you know, it's just been a lot of letting go, and some of it I've resisted letting go of, and my art practices I've been struggling because I've lost studio space, and but these things seem so minor in the larger scope of things. So this past week was really, really hard. And I also thought about like managing my, balancing sort of my need to be self-protective against wanting to participate in protest And I was sort of thinking about my days, like when I was really young and marching with ACT UP, and how fierce that felt, and how important, and that I just don't, I have more, I'm older now, and I feel I'm afraid of this virus, and I don't feel that I can expose myself and I wouldn't have thought of that at all when I was younger. So yeah, it's a daily reevaluation.
And clearly for many of us, it's not even just about exposing ourselves, but because of what we've learned about the virus so far, it's about the danger of exposing others, of inadvertently exposing others. And I think that's one of the things that, just speaking personally, is one of the things that is most troubling for me, that even whatever degree of risk I'm willing to take, I feel responsible for that, but I can't be responsible for making someone else sick. I can't be responsible for making somebody who may be compromised in some particular way, that if I can be a carrier of this thing, it's very different. When the AIDS crisis happened, there was a way in which you knew, at least as gay men, that you could infect other people. And once things sort of settled out, that became pretty straightforward. But today it's very odd. We simply don't know. If you hold the door for a woman at the grocery store and she grabs it, are you inadvertently going to give her something that she really doesn't need or want? And that's the thing, that's the responsibility on us right now, which is, it's hard to take. It's hard to take because, I mean, for those of us who are engaged in the world, it's hard to be so introverted about all this stuff. But with that being said, let's move to the work that the two of you have done, because the work that you folks have done is really about the antithesis of what I just said. It's about it's about the idea of allowing people to understand who they are as individuals, and in a way, it's looking at all of us in an introverted or an extroverted way. And so, how do we bring out something as basic as one's gender, and about being able to look at those parts of who we are? So let's start. I don't care who starts first, but just give me a little bit of background about where gender power came from. And then you guys, I know you have a presentation about it, but either one of you who wants to start, go ahead.
I'll jump in, and Kris, you can pick up the empty spaces. Kris and I were introduced by a mutual friend in 2013, 2014. And we just started talking because we had some overlaps in our practice, and we were interested in each other and each other's work. And we started meeting first in coffee shops and then in my apartment, and had tea. And we were just having conversation, and at some point started talking about power and the intersection of gender and gender presentation, and how that changed one's relationship to power. And at some point we decided to invite other people to sit at the dining room table and also discuss this question. And we started with sort of good friends. And then it started to grow, and there was interest in the project. And we made a performance out of our conversations, and we had a methodology around that. We recorded everything, and then the conversation. So we recorded the conversations, and then we we transcribed them, which was insane, and mixed all the text together so that it was removed from the author, And so we suddenly had this shared narrative and a shared script that could be performed. I'll kick it over to you, Kris, so you can maybe encapsulate sort of the next bits.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that we found ourselves to be in alliance was through personal experience, but we could see how our individual experiences, though they were unique to each of us, shared a relationship to structures of power and control that told us what we could and couldn't do with our bodies. And that, of course, was in relationship to the identity, embodiment, and configuration of our bodies. So it was really, it started to become obvious that expanding beyond our bodies would start to open that conversation up, and that we would make new discoveries about structures of power if we could introduce other intersections. So the project began as a conversation, and that conversation opened up with the invitation for others to join us. And as we have worked over the past 5 years, have we been sort of 5 or 6 years really actively putting time and effort into refining our process and also evaluating the programs that we offer. And so we found ourselves at a place where where we're really looking to include and work with every possible intersection of identity, embodiment, and configuration, really to sort of bring people's personal and lived experience together as a way to focus attention on the systems that seek to control our bodies.
We've done a few iterations of this project as performance. And in the last couple of years, which we'll talk about in our presentation, we have moved the process of creating performance together to a workshop methodology and teaching practice. We discovered that the process of making the work together was in a way, the most important part of the process. It was the connectivity between the group, the community building, and then the ripple out effect of how the process of working together extended to the individuals that participated, and then to their communities, and sometimes their art practices or the way that they wanted to engage with community. So we've worked quite extensively now to create a workshop model, and we have a whole system where we can make short workshops that can be just a couple of hours to extended workshops that can be a couple of weeks. And then we are developing a semester-long course. That's like our real goal right now.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about the goal of the workshops.
Actually, I think Clorinda, who we work with, who has been our dramaturg for many years, I think she says it best when she says there's a value in coming together to make something. And I feel like that, having had her as a part of our process for the length of the time, really for the entire time that we've been working together. And there are a couple of folks who we've worked together with who have been performers and contributed to this process long-term. And those folks help mirror back to us what's really of value in the work that we're doing. And I actually think that is part and parcel of what's, in terms of my own understanding about white supremacy and how it permeates every aspect of our professional practices, to think about shifting away from the product that can be presented and really trying to remove the ego and really shift the resources towards creating a container where people can collaborate and connect. And I think moving towards that for both Maya and I, that's in line with our personal practices, it's in line with our politics, it's in line with what we're asking for from our cultural institutions and our government agencies. And it feels very, feels a little bit counter to the way that we're taught to be professional artists. But it is, it's certainly, the process of coming together to make something is powerful. And I think that if, you know, when we're most successful, it's really not about us at all. It's about creating a platform for exchange and handing that platform to the people who are in that room at that time. And then continuing to work, to do our work as facilitators and administrators to provide them with whatever the group needs in order to advance those conversations. Sometimes those conversations only happen for a couple of hours or a couple of weeks. Some of those conversations stretch out over the course of many years. So I think that's really, well, that's a lot to say, but I think that's where we're coming at it from.
Yeah, I mean, we had to really think about, as Kris said, that it wasn't so much about the product, it was the process. And that was a real shift in thinking, which I feel like it's also in alignment with the shift that all of us are going through right now, but thinking about how we connect and how we make, and the things that we produce during this time, that because time is so stretched right now, and amorphous, like we're now so aware how much time is a construct. You know, being in a room together with people, having difficult conversations sometimes. We really want people to not be afraid, to be free to make mistakes, but also to be accountable to one another.
Well, can we see some more of the presentation or hear some of the presentation?
Yeah, I think that's probably an idea.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to. Okay.
You're sharing some stuff with us here, it looks like.
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
Gender Power is a workshop and teaching methodology that uses storytelling, personal narrative, and movement to question and reveal the dynamics of power in relationship to gender and gender perception.
So despite an increase in visibility and understanding around transgender lives, death rates among trans and gender nonconforming people continue to rise. Not that we expect very much out of the current administration, but even the United States government has recently targeted trans people by reducing the definition of sex down to 2 binary categories, immutable and assigned at birth. We've seen this tactic deployed before, and this is a kind of tactic that simplifies the gendered spectrum of experience around gender, and it frames trans and gender nonconforming people as anomalies rather than a part of the broader diversity of lived human experience.
The consequences of this social political environment for trans and gender nonconforming people results in higher rates of violence and suicide. Using sex and gender presentation as a means to marking certain bodies as different or deviating from the norm is a tactic that divides the American public around race, ability, religion, class, sexuality, age, and so many other intersections of identity.
While direct activism for gender equity has extended some legal protections to trans and gender nonconforming people, there's really been very little shift in the social landscape that affects our daily interactions. There's an immediate, persistent need for collaborative, healing, community building platforms.
Gender Power is doing that work by promoting connectivity, creating empathetic connections, and making space for communal healing practices in our workshops. The images you're seeing here are sourced from past performances and workshops. Some of these are the result of several years of process, and others followed a more concentrated timeline. When we began this work 5 years ago, we started by using our personal experience as a laboratory for revealing sex-based discrimination and gender injustice.
I am a person of trans experience, and so the easiest place for me to start is public restrooms because they've always been a problem for me. So when I walked around in the world passing as a woman, I identified as a butch lesbian. And I can't count the number of times that I've been kicked out of or asked to leave a women's restroom just for looking too masculine. So I've changed my body over the past decade, but I haven't changed any of my identity documents. All of my identification from my driver's license to my passport lists me as F, which I like to think of as standing for feminism more than anything else really. But to everybody else, it means female, and it does not match other people's perception of me. So over the past few years, there have been several states that have attempted to pass bathroom bills. Many of our viewers today may be aware of those. And these are the types of bills that are proposed that would require people to use public restrooms that match the sex that's listed on their identification. So in my case, that would mean that in order to legally use public restroom in those places, I would be expected to use the women's room. Proposed penalties for violators of these bills range from $1,000 fines all the way up to 1 year prison sentence.
And for me, as a queer femme, I confront the insidious sexism that most feminine presenting people face. I could list all the ways that sexism holds me back from opportunities for professional advancement, but I'm sure every woman in this Zoom room knows what I'm talking about. But instead, I'll share a personal story, which is what we do in our gender power workshops. I used to work in an office where I had a kind of quite technical job, and my supervisor was always threatened by me. He was used to being the most technically savvy person in the room, and nobody questioned his abilities or his authority. One day I came to work wearing a skirt, and he looked me up and down and he said, "Oh, I see, you're a lipstick lesbian." And it wasn't a compliment. It was a way for him to assert himself over me, to objectify me and remind me of his masculine superiority. Eventually he was laid off and I was promoted into his position only to discover that I was going to be paid half a salary. And on a minor note, I obsessed about what I wore to work from that moment on.
So Maya and I have been comparing notes from our lives since 2014. And as we mentioned before, in the beginning, it was just the two of us, but we opened that conversation soon to other friends who would become future collaborators. And so a lot of the work that we do is really based on feminist practice and praxis, and in particular, Black feminism. And we sort of take from that, we think about entering every workshop in the way that Adrienne Marie Brown would suggest, like there's a conversation in the room that only these people at this moment can have. So gender power combines storytelling and movement practice in order to find that conversation.
Over the years, we've shifted our focus to the part of our practice that yields the greatest social change, which is our workshops. After thorough evaluation with past participants, we have been able to demonstrate how our workshops create a ripple effect into communities far beyond our reach.
So gender power workshops begin with a series of prompts, such as this one. What is a recent time you felt like you were doing something wrong just by being you? The responses lead to conversations, and then we record those conversations and transcribe them. So we turn to that text to look for the dominant thematic threads. We pull it out and then we generate a script, which is then shared by the group. The workshop continues with a sort of somatic and movement practice. And we invite people to move with us regardless of their physical ability and regardless of their training in movement practice.
Gender power workshops have experienced shift in judgment. They've refined their listening skills and practiced new ways of speaking and moving. They become less likely to make assumptions about others based on personal bias and identify their own privilege as a place to leverage for change. Our workshops have yielded positive outcomes that include renewed or new community connectivity, artistic collaboration, empathetic exchange, increased morale, and optimism.
Much needed in these times. So prior to the global pandemic, gender power workshops have existed in three main modes. The first mode is as a collaborative platform for producing live performance. The second is as a professional development and gender equity training at different organizations. And the third, which is the sort of newest part of our practice that Maya alluded to before, is academic curricula for educational institutions ranging from middle school all the way up to graduate level. So Gender Power is poised right now to sort of extend this transformative process to a wider network. And in response to COVID-19, we've adapted our workshops to be able to be held online and for our future participants to be able to attend remotely. We hope that Gender Power can continue to create space for collectivity and connectivity in spite of our physical distancing in order to save lives, change attitudes, and bring about liberation and equity for people of all gender. So our first Gender Power online workshop will be offered this summer, and it's coming up in July, so just next month, and it will be offered through Gibney, which is in New York City. But as we said, people will be able to attend and participate from anywhere. So we hope you'll join us and follow along at genderpower.org.
That was a really great presentation and sort of understanding what the workshops are about, and the impact that it seems that the two of you have had has really been remarkable. So my first question is, it's for both of you, and as I listen to that and as I've seen your practice over a number of years, I think of both of you as wearing multiple hats. You wear the hat of an artist, you wear the hat as an educator, and the hat of a community builder. And so I would love to hear from each of you how those roles and do, but in particular, I'm curious about how the other two roles inform your role as an artist in your art making practice. There are many in our audience who might think that, art is very two-dimensional or at most three-dimensional, and that it doesn't have an impact to impact our lives in a more direct way. But both of you as bona fide art-making individuals, talk to us about how these two other elements of what you're working on informs your role as an artist.
Would you, Maya, would you like to go first? Would you like me to go first?
Take it away.
I mean, I can say that parallel to my practice as a visual artist, I've been an arts administrator and taken on successive leadership positions within different arts nonprofit organizations, within the museum industry, and to some extent in educational institutions. When I'm in those roles, I'm often self-guiding my own professional development. And I've taken it upon myself to get trained in lots of different ways as a facilitator. And actually a lot of the work that I do right now is about deepening my listening practice. So I can say that my work as an administrator has led me towards facilitation, and that being trained as a facilitator has really scaffolded some of my social skills that I bring in just from my lived experience. And that ends up being incredibly valuable when I am taking on a role like I do with Maya in Gender Power, of being someone who really is helping to create a container for exchange, and to hold that space and to do it in a way that's intentional, to allow for folks to feel brave. We cannot guarantee anyone's safety, and nothing makes that more clearly in focus than the current contemporary situation. All of our institutions and all of us are saddled with white supremacist histories. And so really thinking about using those professional development skills that I've gleaned, that would ostensibly be to aid in my professional trajectory as an administrator, have really come in handy as I am thinking about shifting my my understanding of myself as a creative cultural producer.
Yeah, for me, I started off as a dancer. So this is like being a visual artist is sort of my third career. I worked in theater in between being a dancer and a visual artist as a designer. So I'm very used to collaboration. And I really like it. And I've learned, and I learned a ton from other people. So I'm really interested in that, like what happens. There's a sort of synergy that happens if the collaborative group is well put together, well suited to each other. And I also love working in a cross-disciplinary kind of way. And that comes from my background. But I do remember that I always thought that, we've talked a little bit about removing ego from the practice. And I do remember this moment when I was doing a project in West Virginia, and I thought that it was about one thing. And then I went there and I experienced what was happening with coal mining and mountaintop removal. And I was forever changed in that moment. And I was radicalized in that moment. And I wanted to make art or work that was centered in storytelling and also could in some way be a catalyst for social change. I didn't have any education around that or knowledge of how to actually make that happen, but I felt that there was a way to just to show, and that the viewer could then respond in a way that they brought their past history with them in their response. Gender Power, however, was really a synthesis of all this past experience. And then meeting Kris, I learned so much from Kris. How to really work with, I feel like I learned how to work with community in a way that I hadn't before. And also a lot more about process. I was really focused on end product. And that's just because that's how I'd been trained. And the idea of just the process unfolding and that being the work was a revelation. And it's totally changed the things that I make from Gender Power forward. And then I've also, it's in academia, in teaching, I've also tried to do that with my students. I'm not always successful, but because sometimes they're frustrating. But but I try to see them more and practice empathy, and particularly with this time with COVID, understanding their feelings, but also sharing my feelings with them. I think that having this experience where I'm not an authority figure necessarily was helpful for them at this time.
That raises an interesting question for me just at the moment, in the sense both of you are dealing with students, dealing with individuals 18 to 22 or 23, ostensibly a generation behind you. And so with the work, with your practice and the work that you do, talk a little bit about what you do today and how it relates to your students, apart from an academic standpoint. But I'm really talking, because really what you guys are talking about is something on a very personal standpoint. So I don't care who gets it from an academic standpoint, but I'm sort of interested in what the relationship is like from a different lived experience. And the different lived experience in this case is not about gender or about queerness, but my question is more about experience and being a generation apart.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I think it might be an interesting thing to talk about too, the way that our work with gender power has influenced the other parts of our practice. You know, we've just gone from like, how have other things influenced gender power? But working on gender power has really shifted my practice as a teacher. And the way that we learn to teach is by watching other people teach. And then there's sort of the art education, art ed route. And then there's the visual art route, and the visual art folks often are not getting the content that the people who are studying art education are getting. It's really, gender power has caused me to confront my own privileges. And it has really affected the way that I enter an educational space. It has, it's given me practice in facilitating differently. And that has had an effect on my teaching, not the least of which is just like being careful about my language and thinking about how the words that I say are specific and might land on other people. Even the way that I give instruction around how to work with materials, when I'm describing people's bodies in relationship to materials. And for our audience, my background is in ceramics. Both my undergraduate and graduate degree have been conferred through ceramic programs. So I'm really craft identified. And I really am process based. I put a lot of effort and thought into how it is we arrive somewhere. My teaching has benefited from these practices as well. Partially about inviting people to be their full, authentic selves and honoring them. That we all come together in a space, whether we're coming together for a workshop, whether we're coming together for a public program, whether we're coming together for a tour at a museum, whether we're coming together to do a workshop together. We're bringing our lived experience in, and that is valuable. And oftentimes the sort of Western pedagogy of how to teach and especially how to teach in visual art is about looking at, the canon. And the canon is white, Western, male, able-bodied, and colonial. And so a lot of the work that we've done in gender power has really pushed those questions back onto me about how it is that I function in these different roles, in particular as a teacher.
Maya, how has it affected you?
I echo many of the things that Kris has said, and I'm constantly evaluating my materials that I show in the classroom. I have stripped away almost all the old stuff that I used to show when I first started teaching. Even though some of the stuff was like my favorite films and the things that were so important to me, and understanding how to edit video and all that sort of thing. I also recognize it doesn't mean anything to a 20-year-old in 2020 anymore, necessarily. But some things do. Sometimes there is a crossover, and those are the things that I hold on to. My current students are not. I teach in a private university, so most of the students are of means. Not all of them, but the majority are. So they have a different set of issues. But that said, if students aren't doing their work, I really try to understand what's going on with them. I remember when I first started teaching, the thing I used to say to myself was, this would never fly at ballet school. Like, you'd be out. And so, you know, but I was like, I hated that. I hated that as a ballet student. So why would I impose that on others? So it's actually repatterning, which I think is really like part of what we do in gender power too, because there's a movement component that's part of gender power. And so when you think about how we learn to walk and how we learn to stand up and sit down, that's a patterning that is embedded on a cellular level. You know, when we are, you know, when we first learn to walk, that starts to set into our body, and then it changes depending on how we see ourselves in the world, and if we've had traumatic experience or so on and so forth. So I've had to repattern myself in many ways, and in teaching, definitely. And I've actually done a mini gender power workshop, kind of stealth, in some of my classes, and my students are like totally like, what in the world is going on? But in the end, they really they got into it. So I like to try to do the stealth thing.
Yeah, well, of course,
get in there.
We all love the stealth thing. I mean, I don't know what that is about queer people, but actually trying to get stuff in, you know, under the radar, because maybe because we're so used to behaving under the radar, and so it's attractive if we can actually have real jobs and get stuff in under the radar is really good. Kris, you were going to say something?
I mean, it's to your point, Hunter, it's really about looking at every single platform that we have access to as a place where we can leverage for change. And so if it doesn't matter what you're doing, you have the opportunity to decolonize, to reprogram, and to help others around you, to invite them to do the same. And a lot of, you know, I think a lot of that work happens silently, because people take it as a personal responsibility and decide that they're going to use whatever access they have to extend that invitation to others. And I think that teaching is not a neutral position. Education is not a neutral place. If it was, we would not pass judgment about past genocides. We know that when we're in a place where we are delivering content and inviting people to bring their lived experiences, that a lot of lived experience isn't recorded. So I feel like that's what appeals, and maybe what you're describing, Hunter, is that it's just, we take that up as a mantle because we know that we're not given, you know, platforms or power, particularly as queer people, certainly, and I don't have this experience, but I think by POC, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have different blockades. And don't have the same access. And so it's constantly attuning yourself to your group and to listen to what it is that they're asking for, what it is that they need, rather than assuming that the content that you have designed for them is the be all and end all. And so that can happen in an educational platform. It can happen in an administrative position.
Yeah, and to think that we know all the answers, of course, is certainly not, whether we're talking about age or race or gender or orientation or ethnic origin, it's just simply not the case. Also, I think the thing that both of you were talking about, which is something that is very near and dear to my heart, which is many of us who were doing work for many years, and in a context in which it seemed like, well, somebody else was making the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What we have to remember is that we don't have anybody else to blame except ourselves, because we are at a point now where we actually have positions to affect change. We are people who are in the classrooms. We are people who are leaders. We are people who can actually bring change forward. And that's what's so exciting for me about this particular time, about seeing it, and not to go off, but I will for a second, about the mayor of Washington, D.C., who could simply say, I'm going to make a change. I am going to write Black Lives Matter on a street leading up to the White House so big you could see it from the space lab. That's, and do you know why she did it? Because she could. And so for many of us, it's about doing things because we actually can. It's not somebody else's problem now. It's our problem to actually solve. And so regardless of the roles that we play, we get to use the platforms that we have in order to make those changes. I want to remind our listeners that we're getting close to the end, and so if people have questions, I know, right? I mean, we could keep on going, blah, 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 blah. But if you have questions, now is the time to pop them into the Q&A and to the chat thing in your Zoom here, and also to remind people. Next week, we will be having the author of an amazing book, who is professor at John Jay College, talking about an amazing series of consequences that happened in Chicago in the early 1920s about two gay men that actually killed a young child to hide their relationship, simply because their entitlement led them to believe that they could. So it's the Leopold and Loeb murder. It was one of the most amazing things that happened in the first quarter of the 20th century. And the author of that wonderful history will be here next week. And so please be sure to join us. I do have one more question for you, Kris, and not to get too far into this, but I'm sort of interested in if you can just share a little bit about what you've done in some of the workshops. And you use the word that you've asked some of the workshops, you've asked participants to talk about what was wrong just about them being them. And that's a very powerful thing, because what it is, and it's where I'd like to leave our audience with here, it's the idea about identifying those things and how they can actually be turned around in something more positive. So can you share a little bit of what those experiences were?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, my personal experience with public restrooms is an excellent example. You know, when you are simply trying to empty your bladder, for instance, you're going to the bathroom for a specific task, you should have access to that. That is just a basic human function. But the way that we organize those public spaces is also organized in a system that I don't necessarily fit into. So when I have to go to the bathroom, sometimes I'm made to feel wrong just by being me. But other people have lots of different experiences about that. And sometimes it's about being more emotional, you know, like, oh, someone made me feel bad about expressing emotions or crying in public or having a reaction. So there's lots of different ways that people experience that. And I have to say that Maya and I have worked really hard to develop a series of questions that are so very specific, but worded in a way that is open, that is as an invitation. So really, I mean, that's a carefully calculated question What's a recent time that you've been made to feel like you're being wrong just by being you? It belies a position that our interactions in the world are always collaborative. We are never operating in a vacuum. We are never just one person. We are always one person in relation to other people. And that their perception of our bodies often frames our experience with them and with other systems of power and control. And that there's really a lot of power in sharing those stories with each other, so that we can focus the attention away from the feeling of shame and the individual experience of feeling shame, and towards questions about why do we feel ashamed, or why have people made us feel ashamed for having to go to the bathroom in public, for getting emotional or showing emotions, you know. So that's, yeah. How's that?
Of course, yeah, no, that's good. And of course, same thing for many lesbians, many gay men, many queer individuals, because we live in this sort of just overwhelmingly heterosexual world that we live in is phenomenal. And so getting beyond it, even today, I mean, you know, we talk about the fact that 1950s and the impact the Lavender War had and all that stuff. It still is today. There's one final quick question here, which really is for the two of you, just about any plans about doing a gender power work outside of the States. And I'm also curious about if I was coming from, say I was coming from Wichita, Kansas, and I wanted to do a gender power workshop. Maybe Maya, you can last here at the end here and talking about what you have planned going on. And I know we've given out the website here, but what should people be thinking about if they want to have a workshop?
Well, this time of COVID has actually opened up the possibilities for us to reach people that wouldn't normally or usually be able to participate, because now we have digital platforms. Or I know I personally have attended way more artist talks than I normally do because I just can't get to them. So that's been fascinating. And we are hosting a workshop in July. We don't have the dates yet, but we believe it's going to happen. And that is open to anyone who wishes to join. So if somebody, I mean, there is an issue with time zones for international participants, but we can figure out how to structure so that it works for everybody. And I think we'll probably continue to do it this way. And we'll still, when we're able to, we'll have in-person workshops, but there's no reason why we can't also stream other people in. So actually, it's been quite liberating to think about it that way. Yeah. I also just wanted to add one little thing onto what Kris was talking about. There's an important part of the workshop that is, it happens actually when we have a longer period with people, but we do make these scripts of everybody's responses. And when after we transcribe them, everything is braided together so that my story becomes Kris's story, becomes Hunter's story. And so we have this shared narrative, which not only do you have this experience of having collective conversation, but then it's everybody's experience. And there's this sort of fascinating slippage that happens when I'm speaking the words of somebody else. You want to really honor their stories, you want to embody them. And there's something quite tender about that experience. And I think that is really the thing that makes this sort of cohesion within the group. Sometimes we do this in-ear process where someone speaks into a microphone that's going into somebody's headphones, and then they translate the words they're hearing out. And so that's another way of like embodying somebody's experience.
That's great. It's great. It's a great way to actually end this whole thing. So Maya Ciarrocchi and Kris Gray, thank you so much for being our guest. It's great to see both of you. And for all of you, thank you so much for joining us. Visit our website at stonewall-museum.org. There's a donate button there. Throw something in. We'll be very happy to have you support us. And be sure to sign up for our newsletter as well, too. Next week, as I said, it will be Leopold and Loeb, the story of them. This talk actually will be posted on our website. It could be as soon as the end of this week. And so you can share it with anybody from there. Also on our website, we just posted a virtual gay pride exhibit, which I went into the archives last week, and I found organizing documents about gay pride marches and events in 38 different states going back to 1970. And it's an amazing look at the documents that were actually calls for action. And so it's a very nice way of being able to see that. And so that's up on the website. And lastly, I want to do a big shout out to Emery Grant. Emery has been there behind the scenes, who has been making all of this happen. Emery, thank you very much. We appreciate all the work that you've done to make this happen. And so thank you, everybody. See you all next week. Everybody stay safe and stay healthy. And Maya and Kris, thank you to both of you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.